Is biblical womanhood really a recent cultural phenomenon, and has patriarchy gotten kind of embedded and encoded right into the heart of gospel religious truth in American Christianity? Well, these are some of the provocative questions at the heart of Beth Allison Barr's new book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. So let's take a look at it. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. So like I usually do, I'm going to comment just on the main idea, the research behind it, the readability, and then some thoughts on the reasonableness of the book as a whole. So the main idea here of Beth Allison Barr's new book is essentially that it's really a book about and to kind of conservative, largely white American evangelicals who know that culture and who came up through and grew up in that culture, of which I am one of those. And so the main idea of the book is that this idea of, quote, biblical womanhood, which is actually a pretty well-known, bandied about phrase in evangelicalism. So if you're not evangelical, you're not a Christian, that may seem strange to you, but trust me, it's definitely a known thing. Her argument is basically to kind of interrogate that phrase of biblical womanhood and look where it comes from historically, where really are the roots of it. And then also there's some theological argumentation in this book about interrogating the theological roots of the idea of biblical womanhood, and then also a significant strain of personal memoir. So it's kind of a lot of things in one book, actually. But her main argument is to assert that biblical womanhood is not historically deep or theologically deep, and she's essentially looking to subvert it in her argument here. So that's what it's about. The research behind it, so she is primarily an historian by trade or by training. She's at Baylor University. And so a lot of the research, again, there's different threads to the book, which is one of the things I'm going to come back to. But in the historical thread, a lot of her research particularly focuses on the medieval era, which is her specialty. So she researches a lot of sermons and records from the medieval period and helpfully brings those out. And then also she does, because she's commenting on more recent cultural issues, she does quote a lot of complementary arguments in news articles and popular books by people like Wayne Grudem or Russell Moore, and things like that. So there is this kind of current thread of research on current events and stuff of that nature. But all of it is it's pretty easy to find where she's pulling on or what she's quoting. And it's particularly, I actually found a lot of books, probably 3 to 5 books that I had no idea existed, that I really want to read now because of her research and her footnotes. So there's something there pointing to deeper reading that I was really grateful for. The readability of it, the readability is very high. I mean, this is not a thick academic tome. And also the memoir element increases the readability, I would say, of this book. Her personal story is very engaging. It's written in a very engaging style. It's really, really compelling to keep going. And as she threads that through each chapter, it keeps you wanting to read more. So the readability is super high. It's super accessible. It's not difficult or opaque to understand what she's arguing at any point, I would say. And so it's a good book particularly for kind of an intro in terms of style, writing style, and readability. It's a pretty approachable level. Okay, so finally, the reasonableness. This is always the thing that is of the most conversation around a book like this, a book that's kind of on a lightning rod cultural topic, right? And so it's hard to comment on the reasonableness, so to speak. I just use that term because it's alliterative, but really it's just, is this argument convincing or compelling? It's hard to comment on it because there's such different components in the book, and so I'm going to say a little bit about each component and what I found and some thoughts about that. So first is the memoir, the personal story. I mean, just by virtue of it being a personal story, it's very compelling. And she's very honest. She has some very painful experiences. And I found it very well written, very sensitively written, that element of it very sensitively written. And honestly, I could relate to some of it, which might sound weird, being that I'm a guy. But there's one story, for example, she tells of a summer camp and girls getting kind of accused of being immodest because the straps on their tank tops were too thin at the summer camp. And that story hit me like a ton of bricks because I worked at a summer camp in which that exact issue came up. in the late 90s, early 2000s for me as a very conservative Christian camp. And when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, I just related immediately to that. And I think that a lot of people will find, if you grew up in this cultural kind of subset, you'll probably find something to connect to in the personal story. So that's really compelling. It's interesting that she included that in the book. Now, the second thread is so there's the personal memoir, there's the historical content, and then there's the theological content. And so there's all can maybe be evaluated almost separately. The historical argument is also very interesting and very compelling, and that's probably, I think, one of the strongest elements of the book, which isn't surprising because that's her strongest area of expertise as a historian. But she has this fascinating, I've done a lot of reading on the Reformation and church history, but she has a fascinating argument about the Reformation in particular that I'm thinking about a lot and that I want to do a deeper dive on, which is that the restructuring of church kind of ecclesiology, namely removing the priest and the priestly spiritual authority from church communities, and then imbuing the home and the household under the father and the male and the husband in particular, with that kind of what had been allocated to the priest as a spiritual authority. The shift that happened there for gender roles in society, of course you feed in industrialization and all that stuff too, but specifically her argument about the ecclesial shift in the Reformation and what that meant for women who suddenly needed to become wives if they were going to be good and godly and all of that, because convents and being a nun and being kind of an independent spiritual figure as a woman's really shifted post-Reformation. That is a really interesting historical argument that I have not personally been exposed to yet, at least as it relates to gender and gender roles. And I found that very intriguing and something I want to learn more about as a result of this book. Also, secondly, the medieval stuff is just great. I mean, she brings out medieval characters like Hildegard of Bingen in such a great, vivid, compelling way, and it's a huge service to those of us who don't know. Good Protestants, good evangelical Protestants don't know their medieval history, and so it's really great that she captured some of that in this book in a readable way. Okay, and lastly, the theological argument. This is the one that I know that she's gotten in quite a bit of hot water. She's gotten quite a bit of pushback on some of her theological argumentation here. I am not going to wade too much into those waters here, but I will make a few comments because she does bring in a section on the role that inerrancy has played, the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, particularly as applied to the Pauline texts that get kind of hammered around this conversation about women in church leadership. She brings in inerrancy, and all I'll say about that is I think she's onto something, but the inerrancy section, it's like 3 pages in the whole book, and the fact that it's getting so blown up is interesting to me. But I also kind of wish, if it was being brought into the book, I wish it was fleshed out even more than she has space for in this book. And so it's one of those issues where you kind of bring in a really lightning rod cultural or theological issue and maybe don't give it adequate space to really unpack and give nuance. She does have a footnote at the end that she recognizes there's different ways to think about inerrancy, and she kind of addresses the complexities in that footnote, but it just doesn't feel like quite enough if you're going to bring in that piece of the argument. So maybe a soft critique there. And then secondly, I think the Arianism argument that she brings in about the Trinity and hierarchy within the Trinity and then mapping that onto gender roles, I think she's 100% right about that, and I was really glad she included that in kind of that chapter. Particularly the kind of the subordination of the father and son. I mean, that stuff is just all over the biblical womanhood and manhood conversation in evangelicalism. I was really glad she commented on that, and I think that needs to be really, really ruthlessly critiqued even more. And I do think, at the end of the day, so I think I would have maybe some good-natured, because I'm really, in a lot of ways, on the same page with her. I have some, I would say, hopefully good-natured soft critiques of some of the theological arguments, namely that because there's so much bundled into this book between the different strands of history and memoir and theology, and the fact that it's kept short and at a readable style, it almost feels like some of the theological argumentation suffered by virtue of trying to keep it compact, readable, and include all these other elements. So that's probably the only kind of critique I would offer, is that almost I wish there was just more. I wish there was more diving into the complexities and the nuances of some of the side issues that get brought up that are connected to the super, super important conversation. So I hope that makes sense. I think it's a good book. I think it's an important book in a lot of ways. I am going to be chasing down more sources, like I said in the end notes, that I wasn't aware of that get into more of the weeds. So I think this is a really good, particularly intro text for someone who's wrestling with the issue, man or woman, who doesn't really know where to go with it, but needs some language and needs some further reading recommendations. It's really excellent for that. If you're looking for more of that deep dive, I think it's limited here because of the by virtue of the different things the book is trying to accomplish in a short space. space. So those are some of my thoughts on the Making of Biblical Womanhood. It's going on my shelf. It's something I'm going to be rereading chapters of, especially the medieval and Reformation history content. And so I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching. If there's other books like this you'd like me to take a look at, just let me know. Shoot me a comment or something, and I'll be happy to take a look at more books along these lines.